Thanks for your interest in this Sierra Club program on wood, forest, and embodied carbon. My name is Jason Grant. I make my living as a consultant, but I'm also a longtime Sierra Club volunteer, chair of the club's Forest and Climate team, and I represent Sierra Club on the board, the U.S. Office of the Forest Stewardship Council. Let's dive right in. Forests are vital for people, wildlife, and a healthy environment. They're home to more plants and animals than any other terrestrial biome. They purify the air we breathe and filter the water we drink. They mitigate flooding by acting as giant sponges, soaking up and gradually releasing rainwater. They build soil and prevent erosion. In short, it'll be very tough to get by without them. Forests also play a central role in regulating local and regional climates by creating and cycling rainfall. And at a global level, they're one of the keys to solving the climate crisis, both because they store vast quantities of carbon already and because they have the potential to mitigate global warming by drawing down a significant portion of the excess carbon now in the atmosphere. In a recent report, an environmental group called Dogwood Alliance notes that forests are the only proven system that can safely remove and store enough carbon dioxide to keep global temperature rise below the limit needed to avoid the worst effects of climate change. Forests are engines of carbon sequestration. Because they breathe in CO2 and exhale oxygen, they're commonly referred to as the lungs of the world. Trees use sunlight to convert CO2 to sugar, which is carbon-based and combines with other ingredients to make wood and grow the tree. The chemical composition of wood is about half carbon that will remain safely socked away until the tree dies or is cut down, and its wood rots or burns. Because trees sequester carbon and store it in wood, many people promote wood as a climate solution. A prominent example is the recent surge of interest in using wood to construct mid- and high-rise buildings, where mass timber products like cross-laminated timber, or CLT, can substitute for the steel and concrete traditionally used in the structure of taller buildings. For those who don't know, CLT is a very large wood panel made up of multiple layers of softwood lumber stacked at right angles and glued together. CLT panels are engineered and made to specification in the factory for a given project and shipped to the job site where the building is assembled. The core rationale behind the promotion of mass timber products is that substituting wood for steel and concrete can reduce a building's embodied carbon. Embodied carbon is calculated by totaling emissions associated with the extraction, manufacture, transport, use, and disposal of building materials. Given that a huge number of buildings are expected to be constructed in coming decades, reducing their embodied carbon is urgent, and substituting wood for non-renewable materials seems like an obvious way to make progress. The assumption is that if wood displaces concrete, steel, and other energy-intensive materials in building construction, the avoided emissions could be significant. What generally gets left out of considerations of the claimed advantages of wood use, however, is the impact of logging on forest carbon. And much of this program will focus on this critical missing piece, without which the true climate impacts of the production and use of wood products can't be understood. As the name suggests, forest carbon refers to all of the carbon stored in a forest, including what's above ground and live and dead trees and other vegetation, as well as carbon stored below ground, roots and soil. Logging results in losses of forest carbon at all scales, from individual trees to forest stands to entire landscapes. Logging causes the near-term release of much of the carbon stored in trees as roots rot and logging flash, such as branches, leaves, and needles, decomposes or burns. More is lost as the log is processed into wood products, and the downfall rots or is burned for power. Only about a third of the carbon in the tree is carried through to the end of the processing chain and stored in wood products. When forest stands are logged, there's a loss of carbon stored in soils as well as vegetation. For those not familiar with the term, a stand is a limited and distinct area of forest that is subjected to a specific set of management techniques. The severity of the carbon loss from logging a forest stand depends on its intensity. Clear-cutting results in a greater loss than selective harvesting does. The loss is greatest if the forest was mature before it was logged. Replacing old growth with a plantation can result in up to a 60% loss of forest carbon stores that will not be made up over time if, as is typical, the plantation is subsequently relogged every 40 or 50 years. Also, in the first 15 to 20 years after replanting, a clear-cut stand emits more carbon into the atmosphere and is reabsorbed by the growth of new trees, largely because of the continuing loss of soil carbon. Industrial logging across large areas can be a major source of CO2 emissions, especially when it converts natural forests to intensively managed tree farms. Logging accounts for 85% of emissions from U.S. forests, more than 5 times those from forest conversion, fire, wind, insects, and natural tree mortality combined. In Oregon, clear-cutting millions of acres since 2000 generated 16 to 32% of total emissions from all industrial sectors, making logging one of the state's biggest carbon polluters. In evaluating the embodied carbon of wood relative to other materials, the tool used to calculate and compare cradle-to-grave emissions, life cycle assessment, or LCA, typically does not account for any reductions in forest carbon stores that may be caused by logging. Most LCA studies assume that the impact of logging on forest carbon is neutral, the theory being that in managed forestry, emissions and sequestration are generally in balance. Reliable methods for calculating the impacts of logging on forest carbon and factoring them into LCAs for wood products are being pursued but do not yet exist. The results of LCAs for products are reported in Environmental Product Declarations, or EPDs, and the fact that what happens in the forest is left out of the accounting means that the carbon footprint reported in today's wood EPDs may be wildly inaccurate. The notion that all wood is forest carbon neutral is a vast oversimplification that ignores the starting condition of the forest and the type of forestry practice. According to one recent study, depending on the assumptions going into calculations of the carbon footprint of wood, current estimates of the benefits of substitution may be greatly exaggerated. While the actual benefits of substitution are uncertain, we know for sure that if younger forests are allowed to grow instead of being cut down, emissions of forest carbon will be kept to a minimum, and they will continue to sequester CO2 in ever larger amounts for a very long time. Recently, scientists have begun referring to this process as pro-forestation and are elevating it as one of the safest, most effective, and low-cost approaches to carbon removal and storage available. Pro-forestation is even more important as a climate solution than planting new trees, also known as afforestation, because the latter won't make much of a difference in the next couple of decades when action to avert runaway climate change is most crucial. This is because small trees just don't sequester and store all that much carbon. You may have heard that young trees grow faster than older ones, and this is true, but what really matters isn't the rate of carbon removal, but rather the quantity. A 5-year-old sapling grows fast, but it is so little that the amount of wood it adds every year is comparatively small. A 100-year-old tree grows slower than the sapling, but it's much bigger, so a lower growth rate translates into a larger amount of wood added and carbon stored. Old trees store the most carbon. One study found that in natural forests around the world of all types, half of the carbon is stored in the largest 1% of trees. Another frequently heard argument is that mature forests are quote-unquote decadent and stop absorbing carbon, so we should cut them down and plant new trees. It's a fact that as forests age, emissions from tree mortality gradually increase until eventually, when the forest reaches the old growth stage, emissions and sequestration more or less come into balance as the carbon stored in vegetation peaks and plateaus. But when the forest is logged, we lose a lot of that stored carbon into the atmosphere, and it will take a long time to reabsorb it. Since what matters most is avoiding emissions and maximizing carbon removal and storage in the near term, it makes no sense to replace old forests with young tree farms. Doing this creates a massive carbon debt that will only be recouped if the plantations are left alone for hundreds of years. Now let's change gears and look at how different approaches to forest management can impair or enhance the forest capacity to remove and store carbon. It's relatively straightforward to visualize how this works at the level of an individual forest stand. This chart represents two different starting conditions. The dark green line is an old growth forest, and the light green line an agricultural field where trees are planted. With the old growth, forest carbon starts high and drops steeply when it's logged, while with afforestation, it starts low and builds for several decades. The stand represented here is logged once every 40 years on a sustained yield basis where tree growth and timber removals are in balance. The level of forest carbon drops with each harvest and then builds back up before the pattern repeats. On average, it stays about the same. However, the picture gets more complicated at the landscape level, where numerous stands are being managed simultaneously. Visualize the managed forest as a bucket, and forest carbon as the water inside it. The landscape is made up of multiple stands that have been logged at different times and are in different stages of regrowth. Some are taking up carbon, and some are releasing it. The challenge is to determine how all of these offsetting inputs and outputs affect overall carbon stores. And we need to do that to understand the differing effects of different approaches to forest management. As I've noted, carbon stores are highest in old growth forests, also known as primary forests, where there's been no logging. The water in the bucket is at or near the top. This level is never static, however. The bucket has leaks. Trees are constantly dying and rotting, releasing carbon into the atmosphere. But even a leaky bucket can hold water as long as water is being poured into it. At the same time that carbon is being emitted from the forest, it's constantly being absorbed from the atmosphere. As I said before, the amount of water in an old growth bucket will remain fairly constant over time. When the forest is logged, it impacts both the amount coming into the bucket and the amount leaking out, but the larger impact is on the leakiness. The more holes you have and the bigger they are, the leakier the bucket will become. And the leakier the bucket, the less carbon it will store. In this analogy, the number of holes represents the frequency of logging, and the size of the holes is related to its intensity or severity. The large clear-cuts, characteristic of conventional industrial forestry, can be pictured as bigger leaks, and the relatively frequent harvest can be pictured as more numerous leaks. On the other hand, less intensive logging that occurs less frequently can be pictured as smaller, less numerous ones. As trees regrow after logging, more carbon gradually flows in, less escapes, and the level in the bucket gradually builds back up. But each time logging recurs, the bucket again gets leakier, and the carbon level falls back down. And again, the more intensive and frequent the logging, the farther it will fall, and the lower the average level will be. If there is a transition to climate-friendlier forestry, on the other hand, the holes get smaller and less frequent, and the bucket becomes less leaky. The average level will build up and remain higher so long as the management system is continued. Forest carbon stores are significantly increased. As I noted before, roughly a third of the carbon stored in harvested trees is carried over in wood products and can be stored for decades in buildings and other long-lived applications. This, too, represents a carbon store that can increase over time if the number of wood buildings also increases. And if in fact there are reduced overall emissions as a result of substituting wood for more energy-intensive materials, this substitution benefit will accumulate with time as well. However, any potential gains are offset when logging to produce the wood results in significant net decreases in levels of forest carbon. If, on the other hand, the wood used in building construction comes from improved forestry practices that build up forest carbon, then any substitution benefits will be enhanced. Thus, improving forest management and increasing forest recovery and protection are key to mitigating climate change. The steps we need to take are as follows. First, logging of the world's remaining intact primary forest must cease. Forest carbon stores are highest where there is little or no logging. Therefore, we should permanently protect primary forests, particularly but not limited to those that are the most carbon rich. And in the U.S., these are mostly found on federal forest lands. Second, protection should be extended to allow for pro-forestation of wide areas of previously logged forests, letting them grow back and recover their ecological and carbon storage potential. In some cases, this process of recovery can be speeded through human intervention aimed at true restoration. Where logging continues, it needs to become less intensive. For example, selective logging or smaller, more widely distributed clear cuts, and higher levels of retention, which is to say, leaving more live trees behind after a timber harvest. Another key is lengthening rotations, which is to say, the time interval between cuts. Tree plantation should not be established at the expense of natural forests. Because complex forest ecosystems store more carbon than plantations and are more resilient in the face of climate change, many existing plantations should be restored to a more natural condition. Finally, afforestation is desirable because it brings carbon benefits and will increase wood supply in the longer term. But, as has been noted, it takes decades for newly planted trees to achieve the levels of carbon removal and storage that can be realized much more quickly through pro-forestation and a large-scale transition to climate-friendlier forestry. Reforms such as these would not only improve the management of forest carbon, they would yield numerous other important environmental benefits, including less damage to wildlife habitat, relatively higher ecological complexity and biological diversity, and reduced negative impacts on soil and water quality. As it happens, what is better for carbon is better for all the other critical ecosystem values and services forests provide. We can't solve the climate crisis without increasing forest protection. What's left of primary forests in the U.S. are largely on federally owned lands where significant but incomplete conservation agreements have secured some protections. We need to protect them completely, and this is why Sierra Club advocates for the creation of a forest carbon reserve on public lands that would identify and protect carbon-dense primary forests, as well as areas suitable for pro-forestation, restoration, or afforestation. Along with increased protection on public lands, we need to change our approach to working forests. Climate-friendlier forestry requires a long-term view of forest management and an appreciation for the full array of environmental and social benefits that healthy forests offer. There's a trade-off between maximizing the short-term financial return on managed forests and enhancing the carbon and other environmental benefits of forestry. Unfortunately, our financial system favors quick returns and drives detrimental short-term thinking and practice. Businesses bent on maximizing profit clear-cut, replant, and log again on short rotations because of the time value of money. Basically, potential future income gets discounted such that $1 today is worth more than $1 tomorrow, and $1 in 50 years is worth a whole lot more than $1 in 100 years. By contrast, climate-friendlier forestry requires a willingness and ability on the part of landowners to defer profits into the future. If they do, it's possible not only to increase carbon stores, but also to increase sustainable timber yields. To illustrate this, here's a graph showing average annual timber growth of a managed Douglas fir forest. The dark gray bar shows that the forest is at peak productivity at about 90 years. Acre for acre, the 90-year-old stand is nearly twice as productive as a 40-year-old stand. So why are most private industrial forest landowners cutting the forest before it's most productive? The reason is that we discount the future such that the financially optimal timber harvest falls at about 45 years, yielding a third less timber per acre per year than the forest could be producing. The overarching problem here is that modern industrial timber companies usually have a fiduciary obligation to prioritize return on investment over all else, including timber output. The only forest resource typically valued and monetized is timber. Our markets tend to ignore nearly every other forest value, including carbon storage. Because the greatest barrier to the uptake of climate-friendlier forestry on private lands is financial, any solutions must shift the economics. There are three main ways to do this. Raise the level of the playing field by strengthening government regulations. Incentivize change through policies that price carbon at a level that makes it financially attractive to forest owners to improve. And third, by rewarding it through the marketplace, such as by buying forest carbon credits or sourcing products certified to relatively high standards. We all have an idea of how government regulations work, but pricing carbon as a way to underwrite improvements in forest stewardship is less widely understood. One way to do this is through a cap-and-trade system. At the most basic level, how this works is you tax polluters and use the proceeds to pay for activities that reduce emissions or remove and store carbon, which can include forest conservation and stewardship. For example, California has a cap-and-trade program that imposes limits on the emissions of the state's largest polluters, such as utilities and large industrial plants. Companies that exceed the cap have to purchase carbon credits, and one place they can go to buy them is a landowner who is practicing climate-friendlier forestry. In order to garner carbon credits for sale, forestry operations have to go through a process to become a registered forest carbon project. This includes making long-term, legally binding commitments to forest management that will result in increased carbon stores over what would happen at the regulatory floor. And the more carbon stored, the more credits you can sell. So you get paid for creating a less leaky, fuller bucket. For example, a decade ago, an organization called the Redwood Forest Foundation purchased 50,000 acres of forest land in Northern California that had been severely damaged and depleted by past logging. They put the land into a conservation easement that protects the forest in perpetuity. Trees must be allowed to grow to 100 years old before they can be cut, and timber harvests are limited to no more than 3% of the total inventory. Low enough so the forest will recover, timber volumes will increase, and stores of forest carbon will build up over time. They were able to register and sell credits for over 3 million tons of carbon that accumulated between 2007 and 2014. Forest certification can be another way to incentivize climate-friendlier forestry. Among the available forest certification systems, the FSC best reflects and supports climate-friendlier forestry. Among other things, FSC standards protect old growth and require less intensive practices than are permitted by law. An environmental organization called EcoTrust recently released a study that compared outcomes under business-as-usual forestry at the regulatory floor with those of FSC-certified forests in Oregon and Washington. EcoTrust found that FSC always stored more carbon, between 25 and 60% more on average. They also found that FSC could increase yields on a per-acre basis, but that this was offset by reduced yields resulting from higher levels of protection. For example, FSC requires wider stream buffers than business as usual in Oregon, taking substantial areas of land out of timber production to protect water quality. Buying FSC certified wood products is the most straightforward way I know of to support climate-friendlier forestry, but in some cases, people find that sourcing FSC is impractical. If your wood is going to come from conventional forestry, you could still incentivize the change we need by buying carbon credits from registered forest carbon projects. Registries, such as the one shown here, list a wide variety of projects where credits can be purchased. Sourcing good wood and supporting climate-friendlier forestry is key, but it's equally important to avoid wood that's tied to forest degradation and destruction. And the very worst wood comes from illegal logging. Is illegal wood being used inadvertently in building construction and elsewhere? It's actually quite likely because illegal logging is far more pervasive and the trade in illegal wood much larger than most people think. Particularly if you're using woods harvested in developing countries, products such as plywood, flooring, and the hardwood veneer and lumber used in interior millwork may contain illegal wood. An estimated 50 to 90% of all forestry activities in key producer countries in the tropics is illegal. There are also high rates of illegal logging in Russia and parts of Eastern Europe. An estimated 20 to 50% of all timber traded internationally is illegal or high risk. And illegal logging and the associated trade in wood products represents the world's third largest transnational crime, only after counterfeiting and drugs. Illegal logging is a major contributor to deforestation. Loggers build roads into previously inaccessible areas of forest, paving the way for conversion by providing access to farmers and ranchers. And forests that have been robbed of their most valuable timber are more likely to be burned and converted to other uses than are unlogged or managed forests. This has major consequences for the climate. Deforestation is one of the largest sources of greenhouse gas emissions, contributing up to 20% of the global total. The problems underlying the illegal wood trade are deep-seated and systemic. Illegal wood gets mixed with legal material toward the top of the global supply chain. And once this has happened, it's very hard to detect. Furthermore, current methods most commonly used by law-abiding companies to mitigate the risk of sourcing illegal wood, such as gathering documents or conducting audits, have fundamental weaknesses. Documents are notoriously easy to fake, and auditors who generally pre-schedule their visits can be duped. Even the best forest certification systems are constrained in their ability to effectively screen out illegal wood. Obviously, this state of affairs poses tough challenges for those who don't want to buy illegal wood. How do you avoid what you can't reliably identify? Well, here's an answer. You can support the development of scientific solutions that resist gaming and are being developed by a global network intent on cracking down on forest crime. This is the goal of a new LEED pilot credit that rewards the use of emerging technologies for wood identification and traceability. The experts who designed this credit pioneered a new cutting-edge approach that we call declare, map, and test. The first step is declare. Suppliers provide declarations identifying the wood species and country of origin for all wood products used on a project. The second step is map. Suppliers provide maps that more precisely identify where the timber was harvested. The final step is test, using scientific techniques to check the information provided, declarations, and maps. At the heart of this approach are testing methods that can identify the species and geographic origin of wood products. If wood suppliers are required to declare this information and to back it up with maps of source forests, then these claims can be scientifically assessed. A hurdle to making this approach work is that if wood identification testing can only be used to verify declarations of species or origin, if you have reference data against which results can be compared. So, for example, testing can detect certain stable isotopes in wood whose ratios vary by geography and can be used to determine origin if georeferenced samples of that species have been gathered and tested in advance to provide a basis of comparison. An immense effort is now underway to build libraries of reference data, and the building industry can send a demand signal that supports their expansion. While by itself, declare, map, and test can't distinguish wood that's legal from what's illegal, it does create a mechanism for holding wood producers and traders accountable. And accountability is key because law-abiding companies will be highly motivated to pass tests, and their upstream suppliers will therefore be under great pressure to provide good information and not look the other way when offered cheap wood that may be illegal. When combined with other approaches, this is a powerful way to fight crime and support the many honest companies in the wood products industry. Now I want to come full circle back to the central question this program set out to answer. Is using wood in building construction a climate solution? There's a simplistic narrative out there that goes more or less as follows. Trees suck carbon out of the air that gets stored each time we log timber and use the wood in buildings and elsewhere. We reduce emissions by substituting this wood for other materials, and this process only continues if we keep on logging. The conclusion that follows is that the more we log, the better off we'll be. But hopefully by now it's clear that whether or not using wood will help us solve the climate crisis depends entirely on where the wood comes from, where it does not come from, and how it's harvested. A significant increase in wood use that's satisfied by an increase in environmentally harmful logging and contributes to forest degradation and deforestation will only deepen our problems. The key question is, will using more wood result in an overall decrease in atmospheric carbon and an increase in carbon stores? Without great advances in forest protection and stewardship, the answer is almost certainly not. In closing, here are some resources for sourcing wood responsibly, promoting climate-friendlier forestry, and avoiding illegal wood. FSC has a great website at buildwithfsc.com, and the big new development there is the Wood Funder, a tool for connecting with existing supply of FSC-certified products. Other good resources at this website include a Climate Smart Wood group that you can join to gain information and share best practices, and a continuing education program accredited by AIA and GBCI. If you're interested in learning more about purchasing forest carbon credits, I recommend starting with the Climate Action Reserve website. Among other things, there's an offsets marketplace page where you can find listings of entities that sell these credits. I will say that right now you have to hunt for them, and there needs to be a more straightforward way to find them, such as brokers who manage a portfolio of registered forest carbon projects. This is a project that's worth pursuing. There's a lot out there about illegal logging, but for those interested in best practices for avoiding illegal wood in building construction, I recommend checking out the Timber Traceability Lead Pilot Credit and the continuing education program that goes along with it. Finally, there's a wealth of information on forests and climate on the Sierra Club website, only a fraction of which we've covered in this program. And of course, you can support the club's efforts to advance forest protection and stewardship by making a contribution and becoming a member. Feel free to contact me at this email with questions or comments. And thanks again for tuning in.